The movie The Karate Kid hit theaters in June of 1984. It's a classic underdog story of a small, lanky teenager who gets bullied by another teenager who is not only larger and stronger, but is well trained in the arts of karate. Luckily for Daniel, the Karate Kid, the facilities guy at the apartment complex where he lives is an Okinawan immigrant and a humble karate master. And so the karate master, Mr. Miyagi, trains Daniel in Okinawan karate. And by the end of the film, Daniel has overcome adversity. He's learned the secret arts of Okinawan karate. He's beaten up the bad guy with that famous ninja kick to the face. And then, of course, he won the heart of the girl. This is a classic and endearing story of mentoring. And what makes it so interesting is that Daniel is a teenager from New Jersey, while Mr. Miyagi is an elderly Okinawan man. And they are separated by age, they're separated by culture, separated by language, and even by worldview. And yet the mentoring relationship was able to overrule all of those demographic differences. So this morning we are going to continue talking about biblical mentoring. And we learned that the primary task for Christians is to make learners. That we've been put here on this earth. We've been brought in to the army of the Lord, to the service of the Lord, to make learners. And so for us, mentoring is not an option. It's a core tenet of what we believe. And so in some sense, all of us in this room, whether you are young or old, male or female, we are all called to be a type of Mr. Miyagi to someone, whatever that looks like. So last week we looked at the relationship between Jethro and Moses, and if you have the notes inside your bulletin, you can follow along. They're on the inside on the right. We looked at the relationship. Remember that Moses had a father-in-law by the name of Jethro, and they spent about 40 years together in the wilderness, and we get the sense from the text that Moses held Jethro in high regard, and in some sense Jethro was his mentor. Now, what's interesting is that as we unpack this story, just as Jethro mentored Moses, we're going to find that Moses then turns around and mentors Joshua. And so one generation of mentoring led to the next generation of mentoring, and I think that's kind of the whole point. And so we're going to look at this morning the relationship between Moses and Joshua. Now, we don't have a central verse. We're going to be all over the Old Testament, but they'll be on the overhead so you can follow along. And so let's talk about Moses and Joshua. What do we know about Joshua? Well, we know that he was born in Egypt prior to the Exodus. So he was a slave. And we know that he was of the tribe of Ephraim, and we know that according to Exodus 33:11, he was a young man. We don't know how young, maybe a teenager. What's interesting is that Joshua's birth name was in the Hebrew Hoshea, which we translate as Hosea. Joshua's birth name was Hosea. Now what's curious about this is that if you translate Hosea, or rather transliterate Hosea into Greek, it's Jesus, which we translate into English Jesus. So please understand, in the Hebrew language, Joshua was born with the name Hoshea, which is Jesus. Same name. You might say, well, why do we call him Joshua then? Well, because of Numbers 13:16, which says this: Moses renamed Hoshea, son of Nun, Joshua. And so he went from Hoshea to Yehoshua. Moses changed his name. We find that Joshua makes his appearance for the first time in the Bible in Exodus 17, and it appears that Joshua was some kind of servant of Moses. Now, we don't know how they got connected or how they met, but we understand that Joshua was Moses' second. Now, look at this passage from Exodus 19. It says, Moses said to Joshua, "Select some men for us and go fight against Amalek. And tomorrow I will stand on the hilltop with God's staff in my hand." Joshua did as Moses had told him and fought against Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, Hur went up to the top of the hill. And so Joshua defeated Amalek and his army with the sword. And so what we see is that Moses is really in charge of the army, and he's sending out Joshua as kind of like the local commander. I don't know military ranks, but you understand what I'm saying. So Moses is the boss. Joshua is the second. Now, in the scripture, it also says that so Moses arose with his assistant Joshua, and they went up to the mountain of God. And so it specifically refers to Joshua as an assistant. Now, I'm not going to contradict scripture, but he wasn't just an assistant. He was something much, much more. Remember, when Moses went up on the mountain to speak with God, nobody was allowed to go with him. Jethro couldn't go. The elders couldn't go. Moses' wife, Zipporah, couldn't go. No one was allowed to go up on the mountain, and it was even said that if anyone stepped foot on the mountain, they would die. And even Moses couldn't look God from face to face because he would die. He was only allowed to see God's back. And yet, on multiple occasions, we read that as Moses went up the mountain, Joshua went with him. Look what it says in Exodus 33:11. The Lord spoke with Moses face to face, just as a man speaks with his friend, and then Moses would return to the camp. But his assistant, the young man Joshua, son of Nun, would not leave the inside of the tent. So they would go up this mountainside. Anyone else would die. But they would go up together. Probably Joshua was younger. He was carrying the backpack with a tent. They would set up the tent. Joshua would stay in the tent. And then Moses would go out and talk with God. And yet Joshua was still allowed to climb that mountain. And so Joshua was Moses' second. We also find that Moses had been his mentor for some time. Numbers 11:28 says this, Joshua, son of Nun, assistant to Moses since his youth. And so this relationship had been going on for some time. We don't know how long, but it seems like this was an ongoing thing where he was his second. We don't know how this relationship began, but they've been connected for some time. And the third thing we see is that the Spirit of God was actually with Joshua. Deuteronomy 34. Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him, and so the Israelites obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And so what Moses did is he went and he laid hands on Joshua, and at that moment the Spirit of God filled him. Now in the New Testament time, we don't think that's a big deal because when you confess Christ as Savior, the Spirit of God comes into you. And so if you are a Christian, you have that Spirit. But in the Old Testament, it was different. Not everyone had it. It was only for leaders, prophets, priests, and kings. He would give the Spirit, and when the job was over, he would take it away, and he would give it to someone else. And if you messed up really bad, then he would take it away. So he would kind of give the Spirit to select people. Joshua was one who had it. And finally, in the end, we see that Joshua actually succeeded Moses, became the next Moses. Look what it says in Joshua 1. After the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, who had served Moses. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now you and all the people prepare to cross over the Jordan to the land I am giving to the Israelites. I have given you every place where the sole of your foot treads, just as I promised Moses. Your territory will be from the wilderness of Lebanon to the great Euphrates River, all the land of the Hittites, and west of the Mediterranean Sea. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live. I will be with you, just as I was with Moses. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous. And so Moses dies. The Lord places Joshua in his stead. And so we see this kind of relationship start from being just the mere assistant all the way to replacing Moses himself. And so that's kind of what we've got. This is the inside look at this relationship. And what I want to do is go back to some of the principles of mentoring that we talked about last week and finish off some of these principles. Last week we shared a definition that mentoring is whole life sharing. It's not just me teaching you or you teaching me, or I'm going to stand up here and teach, or I'm going to sit while someone stands up there. It's when our whole life is kind of invested and pouring into someone. And our key verse for this was 2 Thessalonians 2:8, which says this. Paul says, "We were pleased to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives." And so what Paul is saying is, look, I didn't come here just to preach a sermon and give you information. You've got the information. I've come here because I'm going to pour myself out and invest in you. And that's really what mentoring is. It's whole life sharing. It's when we come into a relationship and we pour ourselves out into someone. And so that's the definition we established last week. We also talked about, under principles of mentoring, that there were different types of mentoring, that it can occur in a 5-minute conversation. There can be informal mentoring as you work with someone. There can be seasonal mentoring as someone goes through a crisis. There can also be formal mentoring where we intentionally and structurally pour into another. And the second principle is we ask the question, who needs mentoring? And we said that we all do. But I would like to add one more to that. I think that we need to be careful as we enter into relationships, mentoring relationships, and we need to look for people in whom God is moving. Now, this is an important point, and I want to spend some time on it. I want to talk about discrimination for a moment. We have this idea in our culture that we should not discriminate against anyone for any reason, but in reality, that's anti-intuitive and it's not really rational. We all discriminate, and we ought to practice righteous discrimination. Now, I'm not talking about unrighteous discrimination where we say, oh, this is a person of this certain race, I'm going to treat them differently. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about rational, righteous discernment when dealing with people. So, ladies, let's give an example here. Maybe you're single, or back when you were single, you wouldn't just marry the first guy that shows up, right? You're just hanging around, and the first guy that says, hey, can we go out on a date? You say, sure. You don't do that. You discriminate. Why? Because it's your life. And you want to make sure that this guy can provide, that he can be a good father and a good husband. And so you filter people out until you find someone with whom you want to spend your life. That's normal. That's reasonable. In a sense, you've discriminated, but it is a righteous discrimination because it's your life. When you hire someone, you don't just hire the first person who applies. We discern, we filter based upon skill level, education, and experience. And so in life, that's just normal, reasonable, rational discernment. And so when it comes to mentoring, we've got to show some discernment. Frankly speaking, not everyone is worth your time. Now, this may sound a little harsh, but as a human being, you have limited time and you have limited resources. You only have so much money, so much time, and so much emotional energy to give. And there are an unlimited hordes of people out there. And so we have to make decisions on whom we are going to pour our lives. And even Jesus had thousands of people following him, and he spent most of his time pouring into 12. There was the crowd, of course, of thousands, and then there was the 70, and then there was the 12, and even in the 12 he had the 3, Peter, James, and John. And then even then, I kind of sense that John was his best friend. And so as we look at the mentoring relationship, understand that we can't save everyone, we can't influence everybody, but maybe we can influence somebody. And we have to have discernment on who that might be. Look, one of my mentors was a very wise man. And after he mentored me, after he spent some time pouring into me, he immediately connected me with a younger man. I was 19, and he said, okay, I've got this 16-year-old guy. He's new in the faith. I want you to meet with him. What do I do? Just do what I did for you. Meet together. Here's a Bible study book. You guys are going to go through this. And so I did that for the first time 21 years ago, and I've been doing it ever since. But over the years, I hear a great many people say, I want to learn. I want to learn how to lead worship. I want to learn how to public speak. I want to learn how to teach the Bible. I want to learn how to plan events. I want to learn to do all these things. But people will say, teach me the Bible. But then every time we go to meet, they cancel. I can't make it. I want to learn how to preach, but they're not going to be faithful in their church attendance. I want to learn to lead worship, but they won't actually take the time to learn how to play the guitar. And so as mentors, we have to invest in people who are worthy of that investment. Look for people in whom God is moving. So how do we know? Well, one is we look for a hunger. We look for people who have a hunger to grow. We look for people who can exhibit just basic Christian character and people who will actually show up. But one of the things that I really look for is whether or not God is moving in someone's life. Now, I don't have a particular verse, but one thing that's clear from this story, from the book of Exodus and Numbers, that God was working in the life of Joshua. That you could see his life, and it was clear that this was a rising young man of God whom the Lord was blessing, and it was a worthy pursuit for Moses to pour himself into that young man. The third principle that we looked at last week was that we also need to be the right person to mentor. If you follow along in the notes, we talked about how if you're a parent or a grandparent, that you're really the right person to mentor. In fact, Jethro was Moses' father-in-law. That if you're a recognized expert, it might be that you're just further down the road, and so you're a 30-year-old mom and you've had 3 children. You're not an expert, but you've had 3 children, and there's a 24-year-old gal who's pregnant, and you're not an expert, but you've done this before, and you're just going to walk with her. We talked about that a learner must want you to mentor them, and that we have to beware of the fallacy of the expert. Sometimes we can get too comfortable thinking that we know more than we do, and that everyone can mentor someone. But one thing I would like to add is that the right person to mentor is also someone in authority. Moses was clearly in charge. He was the figurehead of 2 million people. He spoke to God and spoke for God, and because he held this position of authority, he was the right person to pour into Joshua, who would eventually replace him. And so what I want to do right now is I want to address those of you in this room who are bosses. Many of you in this room have a job, and there are people underneath you. You are their boss. What that relationship looks like is going to be different for all of you, but if you are the boss, you have a position of authority. And God has given you that position of influence, and I believe that it's a great opportunity for you to take that and to mentor someone. Now, back when the economy started to tank, back in 07, 08, I was a pastor, but I kind of saw what was happening, and so I took a second job at the East Bay Regional Fire Department doing open water rescue. Now, this is just a name for a glorified lifeguard. We were basically lifeguards on lakes, but we were trained in AED, oxygen administration, first aid, and all that stuff, and it was a pretty volatile job. In the first 15 minutes of my first day of employment, I had somebody else's blood on me. I mean, it was very, very high-stress, action-oriented job where there are literally thousands of people, 15,000 people at a park, and there are 12 of us, and we are first responders in any kind of medical situation, either off or on the water, and we were constantly running back and forth, fights, stabbings. And so one of the things about this job is that they hired people generally that were between 16 years old to 25 years old. That was usually the range of employees. But what this East Bay Regional Park District needed to do is they needed to train up young leaders, and they needed to do it fast. And so you had to go through basically an academy, a 10-day academy, you know, the usual stuff, yelling at you, doing push-ups and sit-ups, and then classroom learning, and back and forth. And so that weeded out some people. But when you finally got to the job, it was very structured. You knew what you had to do. But they would appoint 3 levels. There was just a level 1, that was just you were the grunt. The level 2 was you were kind of mid-range, and level 3 was you were in charge. And what this municipality did is they quickly took 16-year-olds and within a year or 2 had them running an entire facility at 18. So if you started on this job at 16, by the time you were 18, a great many of them had become in charge of an entire facility where you've got up to 30 employees underneath you, and you are in charge of things that are life or death. You're in a park, we've got helicopters, you've got to communicate with the helicopters. We've got EMTs and ambulances, you've got to communicate with them. There's all kinds of legal stuff, there's paperwork, there's equipment. People are literally dying, and these 18-year-olds are being placed in charge, and they're thriving. Why? Because the culture of this company, it wasn't perfect, they had their flaws, is that they quickly and consistently raised up young men and women in basic leadership and management skills. It happened because there was a culture of mentoring. This 16-year-old just comes in, he's green behind the ears. We're going to work with him. We're going to show him the ropes. We're going to give him authority. If he does well, we're going to give him more, and he's going to be able to climb the ladder. And so, if you are a boss and you have that authority, the question would be, how can you use that for the glory of God, to mentor? Here's the fourth principle. That I believe that we ought to mentor from a position of strength. There are three important relationships that I think Christians need to have. I'll throw them on the overhead. One is that we all need a Paul. We all need someone that's older than us, that's wiser than us, someone who's further down the road to be our mentor. But we also all need a Barnabas, that is a colleague or an equal, because what you're going to learn from the mentor is going to be one thing, but what you're going to learn from a colleague or an equal is going to be another thing. But we also all need a Timothy, someone in whom we can invest. Now, I found this when I was back in the day, I did a lot of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And oftentimes when I'm rolling with people, when I say rolling, I mean on the mat, grappling with people. You've got a gi on, right? You're choking each other out, doing arm bars, stuff like that. That I found the way that I learned the most was to grapple with someone who was just slightly better than me. You see, if I'm in there grappling some super ninja Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, I don't learn anything, right? Because I'm sitting there rolling along, and he's like, They had this guy that would come in, he was 75, and he would challenge anyone to do it with one arm. He would take his left arm, he would grab the back of his belt, and he would challenge anybody in the gym, I'll roll with you. And he would demolish people. 75 years old, one-handed. You could not stop this guy, and he wouldn't break a sweat because of the technique. I don't learn anything from rolling with a guy like that. It's just way too good. And on the opposite side, if I'm rolling with a guy who doesn't know anything, like how hard is that? I grab him, I choke him out, he taps. Yeah, maybe it strokes my ego a bit, but am I learning anything? But when I had a relationship with someone who was just a little better than me, that maybe out of 10 matches I would win 2, it's there I would really learn. And so in our growth, we've got to have the different people. We need people that are better than us. We need people that are equal to us, and we need people that aren't as good as us, and we can grow in those relationships. What does this mean as far as a position of strength? It means that if we're going to lead, if we're going to mentor, we must do it from a position of overflow. That is, when we have relationships in our life that buttress us, when we are regularly praying, reading our Bibles, practicing spiritual discipline, when our cup is overflowing, it's going to be so much easier to pour into someone else. But when you look in your cup and it's all crusty, and there's evidence of a spirituality that once was, but is no more, and you try to pour into someone, all they're going to get is bits of crust. And so, as Christians, meet with the Lord, read, meditate, pray, and let your cup fill, and let all that stuff kind of get flushed out, because it'll just overflow, and then at that point, you can pour into others because you've got more than you need. And so mentor from a position of strength. Last week we talked about offering wisdom, and we talked about respecting their decisions. Remember that when Jethro came to Moses, he said, Moses, I've got some advice for you. And he laid out some advice, and then at the end he said, if you choose this, and God so leads you. In other words, the mentor wasn't forcing stuff, he was respecting their decisions and their relationship with God. But here's principle number 7. That mentoring can go wrong. Correction can easily become criticism. And so it's hard because if you have someone that you're guiding, that you're influencing, and you see that they're doing wrong, how do you correct that person when you know that they need to be corrected? It's really hard to do. If you undercorrect, you're wrong. If you overcorrect, you're wrong. How do you find that balance? Well, I don't know if I know it, but here are some things I've read. One is to make sure that relationship is strong. When I have someone in my own life that I know cares about me, and they say, hey, you might want to consider this, I'm going to be more likely to listen to that than if it's just some slappy off the street who's mouthing off. Look, I don't know if you know, most of our sermons are at calvarybcmerced.com. You can listen to them up there. Once in a while we have a tech problem, but most of them are up there, and those go straight to YouTube. Well, guess what? It's open season. Any person on planet Earth can get online and listen to what I have to say in this room and take shots. And they do. I remember, 2 years ago I preached a sermon, and one guy on YouTube commented that this was total venom while I was preaching on biblical sexuality. So look, anyone can criticize, but if you're in that mentoring relationship, make sure that relationship is strong, because it's in that relationship they're going to be likely to accept it. And then they say use the sandwich technique. You know that, right? You say something nice, that's the top of the sandwich or the bottom of the sandwich, and then you throw in your correction, and then you throw in another another nice thing, another praise. But after a certain point, people stop listening. And so you have to be really careful with how much you correct or how much you criticize, because after a certain point, they just don't care anymore. They don't listen. Another thing is that, as far as mentoring gone wrong, is that delegation can be tricky. And what I mean is, if you're mentoring someone for a task, you're at church and someone says, hey, I want to be a small group leader, and they're in your small group. And you're working on them to be the next small group leader. Or someone comes to Pastor Sean and says, I want to be on stage. I want to play the guitar. I want to do this. I want to do that. Or they come to me and, help me. I want to learn how to plan events, whatever it might be. It's really hard, because when do we let them actually go, knowing that if we let them go too early, they might cause a mess, and then if we let them go too late, it might seem as controlling. And so where do you find that balance? Because look, I've heard people come to me, like other pastors, and say, oh man, my pastor, he doesn't do anything. He just, what is he, controlling? No, I'm totally on my own. I'm just left out there by myself. And then I heard another guy where the pastor was so micromanaging the head music leader, and check this out, Sean, that one day the music leader was strumming the guitar, and the pastor got up on the stage and said, no, that's not how you strum. Let me show you how to strum. And he actually took the guitar from the head music leader and said, this is how you got to strum this one. And the guy was really upset. So how do you find that management? Well, this is what Christian leadership guru John Maxwell says. He says that when someone can do something at the level of 80% of your skill, it's time to let them go. It's time to delegate. So you're a small group leader, and you feel that you've spent some time pouring into someone, and they can do it at least at 80% as well as you can, it's time to hand it over to them. If you're a music leader and there's someone who can do it about 80% as well as you can, it's time to hand it over. And then what do? After you've given it to them, you work with them to close the gap to where they hit 90 or 100, and maybe they even surpass you. And so delegation can be tricky in mentoring. Here's another thing. On the side of the person being mentored, that there has to be some obedience to your mentor. Now look what Exodus 17:9 says. Says, Joshua did as Moses told him. And so there has to be, if you're in a mentoring relationship and you're the Timothy, there has to be some obedience there. Now, you guys have seen maybe the Karate Kid. We started the service with that. And you remember when Mr. Miyagi was training him? You might think, well, why didn't Mr. Miyagi just bust out P90X or Insanity? They could do it together, get a heavy bag. But instead, you remember, Daniel had to learn to wax off and wax on. So he got him doing all this stuff. And then he had to paint up, paint down. Now, this was a wise test because, one, it showed whether Daniel had the humility to do some of these simple tasks. But what Daniel didn't know is that when he was waxing on and waxing off and painting up and painting down, that he was building the same muscles that he was going to be using in the art of karate. And so it was all part of the plan. But what if Daniel had said, no, I'm not going to do that. I signed up to take karate. I'm not waxing on, and I'm not waxing on. If you don't have a heavy bag, I want to have nothing to do with this. But he stuck through it, and at the end, he saw that there was a point to the waxing on and the waxing off, and that he had, in fact, built up the muscles that he needed. And here's the final thing, is that if you're the mentor, be sure to encourage. Look what it says in Deuteronomy 31. Moses then summoned Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, "Be strong and courageous, for you will go with this people into the land the Lord swore to give to their fathers. You will enable them to take possession of it. The Lord is the one who will go before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not be afraid or be discouraged." And so Moses encouraged Joshua, let him know that, look, the Lord is on your side, and as you go, He is going to go with you. Here is the final principle that I want to present, is that mentoring leads to multiplying. We find that Jethro mentored Moses. That was the first generation into the second generation. This led to Moses creating officials and judges. So what did Moses do? Moses created a system where they raised up leaders who would judge the nation. What I mean judge, like act as actual courtroom judges. They created structure for the nation. And so Jethro invests in Moses. Moses invests in all these guys, and these guys are raised up now as officials. But this also led to Moses mentoring Joshua. And then Joshua, we read, if we continue the story, he turned around, and Joshua was friends with Caleb, and Caleb's son's name was Othniel. And so Joshua turns around and he invests himself in his best friend's son, a guy by the name of Othniel, who then became the first judge in the book of Judges. And so we see this mentoring starts from Jethro to Moses to all the judges to Joshua down to Othniel, and it goes and goes and it snowballs and it spreads. And so when we take the time to invest into someone, whether it's at church or whether it's at school or work, that is going to multiply, and you will make one of the best investments that you will ever make during your entire life. Look, when I'm on my deathbed, am I going to care, what kind of car that I drove, or what kind of house that I had, or what my, high score was on Halo 7 or whatever it might be? Or am I going to care that I invested in people, and those people turned around and invested in people, and it created a tidal wave of change in the world because I decided to obey the Scripture? And you can have that influence too. Now, it was weird this morning that I'm teaching on this topic, because when I rolled out of bed, I looked at my phone, and I had a couple emails. I didn't hear them go off. But I had an Instagram request. And the Instagram request was from a guy whom I'd already mentioned. He was the first person that I mentored at the age of 19. And he's on Instagram, and he friend requested me. So it's just weird. 21 years later, I get an Instagram request from this guy. We're already friends on Facebook, and I don't know. He didn't do that well with his life and his walk with God. He's doing okay. But earlier this week, I got a call from another guy that I mentored back in 97, 98, 99, a young kid that I poured into. He's now a pastor in Fresno at a very, very large church. And he called me. He said, "Hey, there's this conference going on, put on by Bill Hybels, and I was wondering, would you want to go with me? I've got a free ticket." And he invited me to that. And what you're going to find is that as you go out there and you pour into people, that those are like seeds that are planted, and they bear fruit, and at a certain point, they come back to you. And so now I am being blessed by the people I blessed years ago. And I think that's the whole point. And so the challenge today is to ask yourself, in whom am I pouring myself? And for some of you, you're in this phase of raising children, and that's pretty much your whole life. You're pouring into those kids, and you're doing God's work. But for some of you, the kids are out of the house, or maybe they don't need that type of attention, or you're at work all day, and you have the opportunity. There's young men, there's young women there, and to just kind of keep your mentoring radar on, and to go before the Lord and say, "Lord, I want to obey the Scripture. I want to make disciples, and so show me in whom I can invest myself," and have that radar on. And when you're at work, maybe the Lord will burden you with someone, and you're going to be that person's mentor. Who knows? But just be open to that. And it might be that you want to connect with someone. We have godly men and women here. You might want to be someone. I'd like to lead a small group. I'd like to learn how to perform on stage and worship. I'd like to learn how to preach. It might be that God is placing that on your heart, that maybe you feel that God is calling you into ministry and you want to make that step. Well, then get a hold of myself. Get a hold of one of our deacons, one of our leaders. You might say, well, who are these people? They're on the back of the bulletin. Contact someone, and we would be glad to have someone walk with you as you enter into this new journey.